So before I go into my talk, I would like to give a little bit story of how I came to be here talking in front of you guys about contributing to web standards. So it all starts in 2003 when I was shown a blog, and a very well-designed blog at that. And I was like, oh, I want that. Like, I want that to describe who I am online. And I was told the only way to do that would be to either create a LiveJournal account or a Blogger account, and at the time they both were really ugly looking. And I had to learn HTML, CSS, and all of that to create my site or my blog. So I had to pick up this book, and I'm sure you all know what this book is, and I started learning HTML and CSS. I was studying computer engineering then, and I started understanding this, and then I created this atrocious website, which actually was really more atrocious with the graphics, which you can't see because archive.org didn't save it. But it was my site. I liked pink at the time, unfortunately. But so I created this website, and that was the beginning, and then I actually finished computer engineering degree, and then I started working as a device driver developer at Motorola, writing embedded C++. And I lasted 5 months in it, and then I'm like, no, this is not what I want to do. I want to be a designer, a developer. And then I started freelancing, and then I moved to the US to work as a designer developer for a design agency. So you can expect that I was feeling pretty smug, like it's a mission accomplished kind of thing. I was like, I know everything that is to be known about HTML, CSS. I can create a site in maybe half an hour. What else is there? Like, I know everything. I was even considering a career change. I was like, this is boring. And then I was like, maybe I shouldn't, come to such quick conclusions. I should actually look at my code and see if I actually verify the so-called expertness that I think I have. So I have my own, I still had my website, so I opened the code of my website and I started looking into it. So the first line that you have is the comment, which is okay, HTML comment, no big deal. And then the second line has a doc type, so that less than symbol, the exclamation marks, and all those weird characters afterwards. And so I asked myself what a doc type was. So, and I didn't know what the answer was, other than somebody said I should use a doc type, and I didn't know why. And then I started Googling for answers, and you go through the first page, it's all W3 schools, and then that doesn't give you good answers. So you go through other pages and then start finding out an actual spec, which is shocking because till that time I didn't realize there was a spec, and I also didn't realize these spec authors had blogs and they wrote about these things. And I started understanding what these doc types were, and I started documenting this in my blog. Like, I finally realized there is something more to it than what I thought I knew. And even going through the rest of it, like, I didn't know why I was using the HTML tag or the title tag. Was that really necessary? And I didn't know that. And the more I started looking at my code, the more I realized that I actually didn't know all of these things that I claimed I knew. But once I started researching these things, I also was able to talk to these spec editors. Like, I figured out there's the IRC channel, and then I started asking questions, then asking for clarifications, and these people were very helpful. And it's not like they think they're some big people creating these, they're like gods, creating something extraordinary, and they can't talk to humans, nothing like that. They're very, very humble and very, very generous with their time. And that's when I started understanding a lot more about what it is to actually write for the web. So with all that I gained, I was able to spend much lesser time debugging, like for, why doesn't something work for IE, why doesn't something work for Firefox, or whatever. I understood how browsers understand CSS, HTML, SVG, and how they render. And because of that, I was able to spend significantly less time trying to debug why some part of my code was not working. And then I was also able to better evaluate frameworks. So for example, if you were, people keep recommending frameworks all the time on Twitter or some blog, or some influential person tells you have to use this framework. And then you need to know immediately whether that framework is something you should use now or not. And for example, let's take the example of CSS3Py, and that's something that is claimed that will help you bring CSS3 features to IE. But if you start looking, you would realize that it uses filters, and if you start applying those filters to a large number of elements, it'll slow down the scrolling of your page. It's not quite as useful as it's claimed to be. So instead of spending time, having to face this trouble at the end, I was able to evaluate these frameworks beforehand rather than doing it afterwards. But more than all of this, more than evaluating frameworks, or more than learning to be a better developer, I also was very happy to be able to influence web standards. Like, I didn't realize this would happen. I didn't realize what I had to say or the feedback I had to give would be considered relevant or useful by these standards people, but it was. And I even have an acknowledgement in the HTML5 spec. But it's not something that is special. Anyone can do it. And doing it makes you feel honored, or I don't know, there's a different way to approach the web once you start contributing back to it than what it was before. So there are different reasons why you should be contributing to web standards. So the first thing is, the more you are vocal about the feedback that you have to give, the faster the specifications will move. So if you have feedback about border radius or flexbox or whatever, start giving them so the spec editors can know what they need to fix. And so you can also stop others from making the same mistakes. Like, if they find, if you step into a problem and if you document what the problem was, then the others can make sure that they don't fall into that same pitfall and make that same mistake. And then maybe these spec authors don't know what are the problems that you face, or maybe you have written a lot of websites that are huge and that have a lot of problems that you face, and you require a certain feature to deal with those problems. Wow, okay. That you can't, that they don't know about. So bring that to their attention so they can do something about it. And write tests. So because right now we have so many new features coming in every week. So it's almost impossible to make sure that the browsers render these features consistently as soon as they start claiming they support this particular feature. So the more tests we write, the better we can ensure that the browsers are consistent in their support of a certain feature or API and so on. And then if you are interested in the particular feature, maybe you want to write polyfills and extensions so that people can start using that feature already, so people can give feedback on if that syntax is appropriate, or if that API is correct, or maybe it should return something else as a value. Maybe you should take in an argument that's differently. So all of that would help in moving the web forward. So ultimately, the reason you want to contribute to web standards is making the web easier for you. So if you want to be a lazy developer, you should be slightly more active in the web standard space than before. So I keep talking about specifications, but what are these standards? What are these specifications? So everything that you are dealing with is all documented in this URL called platform.html5.org. So it lists all the specifications that impact you as a web developer or a designer. So if you are interested in any one of them, just go to that site and start looking at the specifications and seeing which one you're interested in contributing to. So any specification is basically a bunch of content that is, there's nothing else to it. It's just a bunch of text. And it is written for two kinds of audiences. One is for implementers like browsers, or it could be like people who are creating apps that have a browser view. Or the other audience is you, web developers, designers, whoever will be using that feature to create code that will be understood by these applications, it could be browsers or anything. So when you see the specification, typically you'll hear the word compliance. So there are two kinds of compliance. One is that browsers comply to specifications, and the other is you write valid code as it is mentioned in the specification. And the way you would know that browsers need to comply with the specification is that there's a word called normative. So in the specification, you would see each section starts with this section is normative, or this section is non-normative. So when it says it is normative, it means that section must be implemented by the browser. So when it says this section is non-normative, it means the section exists to help you understand what the other sections are trying to do. And once you have these things, there's also something known as conformance requirements. So that implies that if you have a feature that's being described, then there's a set of values that it can take, and there are certain values that are invalid, and that's the conformance requirement. But there's two kinds of conformance requirements. One is implementer conformance requirement, and one is author conformance requirement. So for you as an author, which means you web developers, designers, you need to make sure you're using only the valid value for that particular property, or use it in the right syntax. But the problem is that a lot of the web that is out there is written by people who don't quite understand this. So for example, you will see in CSS, I have seen this many times, where you have properties like border radius : none, or you'll have border radius : black. Like, what do the browsers do when they come across such properties? How do they make sure that they break consistently? So that is also documented in these specifications, to make sure that browsers do not do their own thing, and users do not try to take advantage of these invalid behaviors and create hacks and so on. So, so the specifications have to be written such that they account for all of these cases. So these specs seem like it requires a lot of heroic effort, and it does. And these specs are written by what is known as working groups. And so you have HTML working group, there's a CSS working group, there's a SVG working group, and there's a group called TC39 that's working on ECMAScript, which is basically what conventionally goes for JavaScript. And most of these working groups are comprised of people who represent companies who are interested in these technologies. So like Adobe, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Opera, Mozilla, all of these are members of these working groups, and they have people who represent them, their views on these working groups. But sometimes it happens that you may see people known as invited experts. And who they are people who have been actively giving feedback on a particular technology or a particular specification, and then the working group considers their view valuable enough to make them officially a member of the working group. And all of this activity about the working group, the specification, all happens online. Like, it's all documented. There's nothing that's behind closed doors. Nothing of that happens. So it typically happens on mailing lists, IRC channels, and then you have weekly teleconferences, which are also minuted in the same IRC channel, and then there is quarterly face-to-face conversations that happen as well. And there's actually one going to happen the week after next week in Lyon in France, and it's going to be a gathering of all W3C representatives of different companies and have conversations about the standards. So because it happens in the open, everyone can give feedback, and you can read all of these emails. You're welcome to hang out in the IRC channel, especially the WhatWG IRC channel is pretty noisy and active. And then your opinion is typically valued. Like, you need to express it in the right way, but I'll get to it a little bit later. So given that this is how specs work, maybe you want to know when a spec is ready to use. So officially, a spec is ready to use when it is called a recommendation. And you know this because when you go to a specification, it'll say a recommendation, and there is nothing else to it, and then you'll have the spec itself. So the process a specification takes to become a recommendation is kind of a long one. So the first thing that happens is people interested in making this specification propose to have a specification to the working group. And then if the working group is interested or thinks it's worth pursuing this, then they will say, go ahead and start working on a draft. And then the people who express interest in this specification would appoint editors and then start working on the draft, and then it'll become editor's draft. And that's where the latest activity or the opinions of the editors are reflected all the time. And then it comes to the working group, and then the working group decides if it should be published as a working draft. And then it gets published as a working draft, and then it becomes a first published working draft. And then this circle keeps going on and on until there's a time where it is, the working group thinks the spec is more or less stable, where you typically will not be hearing, like, there is not much more conversation going on in the mailing list and so on, and they think it's all more or less ready. in which case they make this last call for comments, in which case that's the last time you can make comments on that particular specification. It's getting serious. It's almost going to be a recommendation. And then, then it becomes a candidate recommendation. So once it's a candidate recommendation, the only way it can become a proposed recommendation is to have 2 or more browsers implementing that. And then once that happens, then becomes a proposed recommendation. And at that point, it's more or less done. So unless you have some really compelling arguments why it shouldn't be a recommendation, it will go forward. And the only way it can escape from proposed recommendation to a recommendation is to have 2 or more browsers that pass tests associated with that specification. So the more robust the tests they are, the better these browsers will be for that particular spec. And then it becomes a recommendation. So if you think this is a long process, it is, actually. Because if you look at the past timeline, these are all CSS3 specs, so-called. And the average time seems to be about 11.5 years. But it is kind of odd, but it gets better these days. And all of the newer specs that have been proposed, we have seen implementations almost immediately. So recently, we have seen turnaround times of 3 years or less. Hopefully, it will be lesser. But unofficially, in my view, a spec, I would think, is ready to use when it has a stable syntax. And for example, if you've worked with gradients, you know we have had at least 4 iterations of the syntax until we settled on what we have right now. And same with Flexbox, which had like million alterations of syntax until we have settled on something final now. And then you need stable implementations, and in my view, 3 or more rendering engines, and not just browsers, because you want it in not just WebKit, but also in Trident for IE, and then Gecko. Make sure you have as many rendering engines as possible, and that would imply that it's more or less stable to use. And then it also needs consistent behavior in all of them. So it can't be like in one browser it does something, and in one other browser it does something else. And then it should have a fallback story that's good enough. And for example, if you're using Flexbox, in browsers that do not support Flexbox, it just looks completely unreadable. Like, people cannot even use your website if you're using Flexbox on those browsers. Now, that's not good. So you should ideally not be using Flexbox until there's a stable implementation in multiple browsers. So, or if you think this is all too much for you, you can just go to html5please.com that I created with a bunch of other people, and I maintain where we have an opinionated list of features that we think are ready to use. And we outline why we think it's ready to use and how you should be using them with polyfills or with fallback and whatnot. So if you are interested in participating, there are 2 ways to participate. The first the baseline is you have to be reading the specifications and then asking questions. And then once you understand and learn something more, contribute back to the documentation and make sure you document what you've learned. So I had a hard time knowing where these specifications were, because there are different kinds of specifications. And the specifications that you are interested in are typically editor's drafts. And for CSS, those drafts are located here, and there's a mailing list, which is very, very high frequency mailing list, so beware. And there's IRC channel, which is usually pretty quiet. For HTML, there are 2 kinds of specification. One is a stable spec that's at W3C, and then there's the latest bleeding edge version, or HTML Next, whatever you want to call it, that's on the WhatWG URL. So the IRC channel is pretty active, very active. I would rather have, if you have questions, just ask on the IRC channel. Typically, you'll get a response earlier than on a mailing list. And the mailing list, there are 2 mailing lists again. The public-HTML one, you can only read, not subscribe. But the WhatWG one, you can subscribe. So that's great. And it's also that's where most of the activity happens with HTML Next stuff anyway. And for JavaScript, there's the ECMAScript wiki page, which outlines ES6, whatever is happening. And then there's a mailing list as well. And there's a guideline on how to review ES6 drafts that I think is very useful if you are interested in the next stage of JavaScript. So SVG, there is work ongoing on creating SVG2 specification, and it also has a mailing list and IRC channel, which is also pretty quiet. So there are different ways you can give feedback on specifications. The first is as a web developer. And the easiest way to give feedback is if you don't understand what the specification intends, or you don't understand what it means. So all these specifications are not written as a cure for insomnia. They are supposed to be something that are readable and understandable by you. So if you don't understand, then you should make sure you ask questions in the appropriate forums that I just mentioned, and make sure you clarify it so that other people who come after you can understand this. So there's the other one is if you find something hard to use. Typically, there are so many features that are hard to use. So maybe you find multiple box shadows hard to use, or something like that. So give feedback on those things so that they can make it easier for you. And maybe there's an obvious use case for something that's not been covered. So maybe there's a use case for inset box shadow on images that is not being covered, and that you want to mention it to this mailing list. So mention it and make sure that people know what that use case is that you're not covering. So maybe there are some features that are in the spec and they don't work as intended. So maybe you're trying it out on browsers and you see that the browsers are not doing the right thing, and in which case you would have to start filing bugs. Maybe it's a specification bug or a browser bug, so start doing that as well. And then there's a lot of people who are coming to HTML these days who have been doing programming on maybe C, C++, or Java, or Ruby, and whatnot, and then they are now forced to write HTML because that's what their bosses tell them. And so when they come to HTML and they start looking at HTML, this is the first reaction, which is that the API sucks, the CSS sucks, everything sucks, and whatnot. But you need to understand that HTML, CSS, JavaScript has all been written for making sure that content don't break on the web. So anyone, your father, your grandfather, your grandmother can go to any website and make sure that they can see and understand what those websites say, irrespective of how terrible the web developer of that website was. So the HTML design principles outline a lot other philosophies behind why HTML APIs are what they are and how they should be. Now, if you still think that this API could be improved, then go ahead and file suggestions on how that can be improved. And maybe this is the second common alternative, is that this does not have an API. Usually you have all these CSS animations that are lacking in events. There's not sufficient events being fired. Maybe you should give feedback and say this is not happening and you want this to happen, and so on. And maybe there's a syntax that you think is completely wrong, and maybe you should give feedback on that. So I really think the CSS variable syntax is sucky, but I have given as much feedback as I could. I don't think I could improve it. But I mean, if you think so, then go ahead and be vocal about it. So at least they know that it's not something that is accepted by the community. So there is a way to give feedback. There's no one general mailing list. Well, not quite for most of these specifications. So each of these specifications has an area where it tells you where to give feedback. So for example, in this exclusion spec, you have this heading called discussion, and it tells you what's the mailing list and what subject line to use. Because these editors get a lot of emails. They get more than 500 emails a day, and they need to filter these emails to make sure that they respond to the appropriate feedback. And so you need to use the appropriate subject line. And then there's a way to ask. I mentioned that if you ask in a way, you would get a response, and your opinion would be valued. So there's a way to ask that would give you a response. And I think this applies in general, not just to mailing lists for standards. So the first thing to do is, should you even ask? So you need to search the mailing list and find out if this question has been asked before. And a lot of times, the border radius or the box shadow, all the examples that I just gave you have already been asked. And if you ask the same question again, people are just going to ignore you. They are not going to reply, because it's questions that they have repeatedly tried to answer and respond. So search the mailing list, and if there's something that has been talked about and you still have some concern that is different from what has been asked, then make sure you reference those emails and tell the people that, hey, my concern is different, so this is why you should pay attention. And then write in plain text, because these people who are contributing to the specs, they get a lot of emails, and they have their own ways of dealing with it. So they may use command line clients and whatnot. So you need to make sure that you reach as big an audience as possible. So write in plain text. And then if you're responding to somebody's comments, make sure that you're responding in context so people know what you're responding to. So inline code your response as a snippet. For example, this is an example of how that would look like. So Boris is responding to Tab's comments, and he just snipped the particular line that he's responding to so people know exactly what your response is about. And then make sure that you cite references, because a lot of times if you don't cite references, it becomes into trolling match, and everyone starts having these emotional conversations that just is not healthy. So every time you are stating some facts, make sure you back it up and you have references to it. So this is an example from Leah Baru to the CSS mailing list, and she has all these references in brackets, so people know exactly what it is being responded to, what's the context, so they can do this appropriately respond back. And then ask specific questions. Like, you can't just say, oh, this API sucks, or this syntax sucks, or I spent so many hours debugging, it's not working. No one's going to respond to that. Like, they don't know what to react to. So maybe you want to say, this syntax is not appropriate. These are the reasons. This is my suggestion. What do you think? So people know whether to say yes or no, and they know what specific action to take. And then basically, whenever you write an email, make sure you've done the work. So people know that you've put in effort to identify not just the problem, but also a solution, and they know how you failed. So they can put in extra work to make sure that they respond to you and help you not fail. So people do that in the mailing list all the time, but they just need to know that you've done the effort. And until you express that in an email, they will not be able to do that. So there are lots of times you'd find bugs, and the first thing to do is that you need to isolate the bug. And you can do that by going to any of these sites, Dablet, CodePen, all of that, and create a simple test case that would trigger the bug. And Chris Coyer has written a great article on how to create test cases, a reduced test case. And once you find a bug, you need to figure out if it's a specification bug or it's a browser bug. And the way you would know it's a specification bug is when every browser breaks randomly. Like, it has completely different effect on each browser, and you don't know what's the right behavior. Now, if it's just a browser bug, you know that there's just one browser that is not behaving as it's intended to be. So it should likely be a browser bug. But then again, it's not so clear. But once you start filing bugs, people will tell you if it's a browser bug or a specification bug, and you can file appropriately the right bug. And before you even file a bug, you need to find out if this bug has been reported, because filing duplicate bugs is just annoying. So look for it, and then see if it's been reported. If it has not been reported, then file a bug. And now there is also a good way to file a bug so that it gets resolved. And I think this, again, Leah Baru has written a great post on that, and reading and understanding and knowing how to file a good bug is not just useful for the web, it's also useful in your own work. And you may have to file tickets for open source projects and so on, so that's going to help you. So once you start contributing to the web, you'll find out that your time is just slipping away from your fingers. It's just like very overwhelming. It's just, you may want to just step back and whatnot. So you should make sure that you preemptively schedule your time. And the way you would do that is first filter all your emails, because you're going to get at least 1,000 emails a day, and that's not what you want. And make sure you filter it to different folders, and you only look at it at a certain aspect of the day. So schedule your times. Make sure you only look at them once a week or twice a week, or maybe an hour every day. And then maybe you want to schedule weekly goals. So Edward O'Connor, who now represents Apple at W3C, had these as a weekly goal, except for the last one. And for him, the goal was to always file a bug, or write a test case for any specification, or give feedback on a feature or spec. And I added the last one on document a property or an API on webplatform.org, because it's simple to do, at least for the basic ones, and you can start doing it at any time. You just need to sign up on webplatform.org. So maybe you're not interested in weekly stuff, then maybe you want to participate in events. So you have hackathons. There's something that's coming up that Peter's going to talk to you soon about. And we also have, we organized Test the Web Forward about a few months ago in San Francisco, where we had web developers and editors come together and write tests for specifications. And it may seem like it's a very boring activity, but luckily it was actually a pretty good one, and I participated. And I didn't know what CSS object model was even. And then when I started writing tests, I understood what that was, and I understood how badly supported it was in browsers. And writing those tests helped me understand all of these, the APIs that were available, and so on. So I recommend you participate. There's one, we're going to have 2 more Test the Web Forwards. One's happening in 2 days in Beijing, and one in Paris next week. Hopefully we'll have more of it soon, but if you're interested, just follow that Twitter account to find out when the next one's happening. So maybe you have features that you want to test, like you may want to find what's the state of support or what's up with IndexedDB, and maybe you spend like 2 hours understanding it. And once you do find out about it, make sure you contribute back. So submit a pull request to html5police.com, and with your assertion statements on these features that you've tested. So more than anything else, there are a lot of form elements that are new in HTML5 that have not been documented correctly. And we'd love pull requests on html5police.com for those things, especially, I think, input, email, and so on. There are different things that happen that we like to catalog. And then again, the most passive thing you could do is document the web. It's not that difficult. It's slightly difficult. You have to spend a little bit of time researching things, but it's pretty interesting to do. And then, so join webplatform.org and start contributing. If you have questions, then ask on the IRC channel. It's pretty healthy and active. A lot of us hang out there. We'll be able to help you in contributing. And there are all the other ideas. A bunch of us created this site called movethewebforward.org. So there are a lot more activities you could do. Maybe just pick one up and start doing that. So in summary, these are the things that you could do. Read the drafts, read the specifications, ask questions, give feedback, write about what you have learned, and then write tests or participate in events to make sure that you keep creating stuff for the web.